Good evening. I'm trying to think what I can add to that introduction. I've been a member of the Huddersfield Canal Society since the 1970s, 1976, I think it was. I think anybody who was a member back then, I mean, the key part of the Huddersfield Narrow Canal is Standage Tunnel, and I think by the time I joined the society, it had been closed for several years, and it remained closed and strictly off limits through pretty much all the time up until shortly before it was reopened in 2001. I think the inability to get in there, generates its own interest. During most of the time I was a member, I've been responsible for the society's volunteer activities, doing various work from lock restoration through to these days just routine maintenance tasks. But I think throughout all this, I maintained this interest in the tunnel. We did have a member, a chap called Jeff Brown, who had more or less devoted his life to Standedge Tunnel. First met him in the early 80s, at which time he said he was working on a book about the tunnels, but he never managed to publish it, and sadly he died a few years ago. His wife gifted us his research, which took me 2 trips, absolutely ramming the car full to the limit to move it all. And I think I formed the opinion that for Jeff, the research was the thing. Writing the book was very much a secondary thing. She wanted me to publish a book, but at the time I wasn't particularly keen on the idea. It wasn't until I think it was 2016, the Canal and River Trust, who now operate the tunnel, decided that they would accept volunteer boat chaperones, as they're called. More of that later. I finally managed to get in there on a regular basis. And in the course of that, I realized that some of the stuff that had been published, with a particular example being by Professor Schofield, one of the foremost industrial archaeology writers of the time, weren't strictly right. So eventually I did decide to take it on board. Anyway, let's proceed with the let's see if I can get myself that's better. Oh, that's no good. I'm starting part way through. Right, so the Standage tunnels. The first thing I'll do is I'll turn myself off, and then I'll give you a little bit of history. I apologise for this map. It's a rather old Imre's map of the waterway system, but it's the only thing I've got that actually shows the gauge of the various waterways. What you've got there are the Transpennine canals. You've got the Leeds and Liverpool Canal at the top, which, as you can see, is an extremely long way around. You've got the Rochdale Canal there, and this sort of thin red one is the Huddersfield Narrow Canal. The problem with the gauges, the blue stuff, you can get a boat of something like 72 feet by 14 feet on those canals. The green ones shorten to typically about, well, the shortest ones are about 57 feet by 14 feet. And the red ones take what's normally known as a narrow boat of 70 feet by 7 feet. And you can see on there that although the Huddersfield route is by far the shortest way, it sadly has more breaks of gauge on it than any of the other routes. And the end result of this was that you can only get a boat right the way through. That's something like 57 feet by 7 feet, and it doesn't carry very much, unfortunately. Moving on, this is the old marketplace as it used to be in the centre of Huddersfield. In 1793, a meeting was arranged to promote the idea of the Huddersfield Narrow Canal, or the Huddersfield Canal as it was then known. This was a period in history which is known as the Canal Mania. There was already water access from Hull to either Huddersfield or Soby Bridge on one side of the hill, and also from Liverpool to Manchester on the other. And it was a competitive environment to build the first Transpennine Canal, and 3 groups of people were going at this. The thing about the Canal Mania was that certain of the earlier canals had been massively profitable, and the Birmingham canals, for example, were paying a dividend of something like 40%. And of course, people being what they are, they, you know, the thought had gone out, you know, I must get into canals and get my 40%. I think people didn't look at why the Birmingham Canal was paying its 40%. You know, it was in a massive city with lots and lots of industry. There were coal mines everywhere. You know, the traffic was absolutely massive on there. But, you know, people thought that the same would apply wherever you built a canal. Anyway, people virtually fought over the shares, and in 1794, an Act of Parliament was passed for making a navigable canal from and out of the canal of Sir John Ramsden, Baronet, and communicating with the canal navigation from Manchester to near Ashton-under-Lyne, which was only just being built itself. This is a map which was produced at the time by a chap called Nicholas Brown, who was the sort of assistant engineer. In those days, what they tended to do was to employ an overall engineer, in this case a chap called Benjamin Outram, and then some more local chap who would be constantly present got the assistant's job. And this is Brown's map. You've got Huddersfield there. That's the Huddersfield at the top right, which is the let's have a look. I'll just mark these things. Yeah, that's Huddersfield there. The bit at the top is Sir John Ramsden's canal. It proceeds up the Colne Valley, eventually reaches Marsden, where they were going to require a tunnel something over 3 miles long. And then it will proceed down the Tame Valley on the other side of the hill to Ashton-under-Lyne, which is hereabouts. The problem with the tunnel was Outram pronounced that he could build the tunnel in 5 years, and he said that the going through there would be uniformly easy, and that very little of the tunnel would need to be supported. I mean, I think anyone who knows anything about tunnels would immediately recognise that the two things are incompatible. You know, if the going's easy, you're probably going to have to support it, and if it's not easy, then you know, that's more of a problem. But as I say, it was the canal mania. People could smell the 40% dividend, and nobody cared too much about that. Yeah, this is quite an old picture of Tunnel End at Marsden. The reason I'm using a very old picture is that if you go to that spot these days, practically all you can see is greenery. The amount of tree growth in this part of the world since they gave up with all the sort of coal-fired mills and other industry has been amazing. But you've got the Canal Tunnel, which is there. You've got the first railway tunnel to be built, which is that one. The Canal Tunnel was started in 1794 and finally finished in 1811, which gives the lie to Outram's pronouncement about getting through there in 5 years. The first railway tunnel dates from the 1840s, to be precise, 1845 to 1849. And it's known as the Nicholson Tunnel from the chap who did a lot of the building. In the 1860s, 1868 to 1871, they built another single-track railway tunnel, which is known as the Nelson Tunnel. And finally, in 1890 to 1894, a double-track railway tunnel, which isn't named after anybody in particular and was built in-house by the London and North Western Railway Company. I think this picture must be celebrating the completion of that, because if you notice the exceptionally clean ballast under the two lines heading into the tunnel there, and you know, this nice clean wall here which has been being built. This is a picture of the works in progress. It's something of a mess, but the two working tunnels there. This is the new double track tunnel being built, and at that point they've got the canal drained. So this is looking the other way at about the same time, although the canal is in water there, and you know, you've got various of the boats there that they used to bring spoil out of the tunnel. Going back to the original building of the Canal Tunnel now in 1794, they originally planned 14 shafts to build the Canal Tunnel. At the Diggle end, where the ground rises fairly slowly, they managed to put in something like 6, or started putting in 6, which was pretty much how canal tunnels were built in those days. You know, you built lots and lots of shafts and just linked them together. However, Standage being Standage, you know, it wasn't that easy. And in the central part of the tunnel, the shafts spread out quite a lot. There was one at a place called Brung Clough, and then you go over the summit and There were actually two at a place called Red Brook, and they were going to build one at a place called Heathy Lee, another at a place called Puel Hoyles, which these days is known as Flint Shaft. And then they managed to get three in at the Marsden end, although the one at Puel was getting pretty deep. This shows the problem that they had. Obviously, it's not to scale, but it illustrates very well what the difficulties were. This is dated 1803. Again, I think it's by Nicholas Brown. And I mean, you can see the difficulty there. I mean, this line across the bottom, the thick line at the bottom is complete at tunnel, and the thin line is heading. And I mean, the thing that it brings home to you is, you know, how much shaft digging they've done and how pathetically small the amount of tunnel dug is for something that's now been going on for 7 or 8 years. I mean, you'll also notice that that some of the shafts are nowhere near the bottom. These things, by the way, where are we? Yeah, these things are drainage adits with their own shafts to enable them to be built. So although it's not very clear on the section, those would run to a nearby stream. They did use water power for a lot of the work, so that they didn't just serve a drainage purpose. They also enabled them to use water engines, of which more later. One of the problems that arose, of course, was that not having properly allowed for all of this extra work, the money ran out, not helped by the fact that in 1799 a massive flood swept away quite a bit of the canal which had been built on either side of the hill. I mean, this has got to be just bad estimating. I think probably what Outram had done was to estimate on the basis of a normal canal tunnel, which probably had shafts. Well, some of the deepest shafts on other canal tunnels are about 100 feet. I think more typically around about the 50 mark, and some of the shafts on Standage Tunnel are 500 feet. So you know, there was a lot of digging to do. Anyway, let's have a look. We're going to start at the Marsden end and work across the hill. So this is, you'll see what I mean about the trees now. The canal tunnel is more or less dead ahead in the middle. And I mean, you just cannot get anywhere near seeing the railway tunnels on there. This is a closer shot of the tunnel. What you see here, the white thing, which anybody who went on the trip through the tunnel will recognise today as the trip boat. Those were originally built as tug units with a passenger module. And the idea was, when it first reopened, that they would tow boats through. They wouldn't allow people to take their own boats through. They were absolutely petrified about health and safety. I mean, to this day, they're very, very worried about anybody taking anything flammable through there. But when it originally started, you know, the health and safety panic was total, and you know, everybody had to be under supervision in this thing at the front, and you know, the boats were towed through. The problem with this was, of course, that they had to find means of fastening them together. So, you know, they came up with some quite complex stuff involving strange shaped bits of rubber, and this shows them connecting a tow of boats together at Diggle. That's one of the things there deflated, lying flat on the ground. The stuff on the trailer at the right-hand side there came about slightly later, when people started complaining about the fact that their boats were getting severely damaged by bumping into the sides of the tunnel, because obviously if you've got 4 or 5 boats on the back of a tow, they tend to swing about and catch things. They ended up with a situation where they'd got something, I think 2 people on the tug and passenger module, and somebody on each boat, so you know that could be up to about 7 people. And they also used to shadow this lot with a vehicle travelling through the disused railway tunnel. And you've got somebody called the tunnel controller who sits in the cottages at Marsden and monitors the whole thing. So that's what you're getting on for 10 people, isn't it? You've got involved there. The rubber sheeting actually didn't help all that much. It did take a little bit of the damage off, but unfortunately it picked up a lot of grit and people's paintwork tended to get sanded, so it wasn't too popular. So that's where I come in. They decided that they would operate allowing people to take their own boats through. They finally realised that a lot of the fears they'd had about ventilation were pointless, because you know, if you're sharing a complex of tunnels with diesel trains, you know, anything that a diesel narrowboat turns out tends to be a bit incidental. But they also decided that they would allow some volunteer boat chaperones, as they were called. The title chaperone, I think, is perfect. Is carefully selected. The idea being that, you know, you're not actually totally responsible for what goes on, but you know, you're just there to give helpful advice and try and keep people out of trouble. But you'll see me there measuring up a boat. There are strict limits to the measurements that are allowed, and I'm using our super modern measuring system, calibrated in imperial, needless to say. And one of the other chaperones is looking on to just you know, sight up the height on the corners there. These corners are where any damage tends to occur. We don't automatically reject every boat that fails the test. This is one example which measured too high. I mean, you can see it's fairly high by looking at it, but the 3 things on the front there are containers of water, and presumably the fact that we've got some on the front means that we've also got most of the front well full of them as well. So that one's been made to fit. And here you see one of my colleagues with the boater, who's also tugged up with all the hard hat and reflective gear, setting off on a trip through. Immediately inside the tunnel is this broad arch where the railway, double track railway, crosses over. Coming up the valley, all the railways is on one side of the canal, but when they built the double track tunnel, it was obviously impractical to build it further over than the 2 existing ones, so they put it on the other side of the canal and took it across at both ends. You then go into a lined section, which is pretty tight, and it suffers from this type of thing here, which is a sort of sticky out edge. That's what does the damage to a lot of the boats that get caught. A little bit further in, you come to the first of this stuff. When they built the first two railway tunnels, they were still working with, well, mainly with black powder. By the time they were on to the double track railway tunnel, they got all sorts of exciting, more modern explosives. The downside of which was that it did a terrific amount of damage to the canal tunnel. So much so that they had to close it for 9 months after they completed the job and send all the bricklayers in to build reinforcing arches like this. There is a massive length of these out in the middle. A little bit further, you come to the first of the shafts that remain open. The first two on this side were filled in when the well, at various times in the history of the tunnel. But this is Puel Shaft, which was the third one on that diagram I showed earlier. This is, now how deep is it? I've got the note somewhere. Just over 500 feet deep already at this stage, so massively deep by canal shaft standards. You'll also have noticed that it's very wet. This is up on the top. For some reason, this one has a square wall around it. That thing in the foreground is a London and North Western Railway boundary post. In the early days of building railways, they seem to have had to buy the land over the top of a tunnel, although I suspect from certain things I've seen that might have changed later. But looking in the background, you'll get some idea of the height that this thing is at. The Marsden level is the highest canal level in the country, something like 642, I think, feet above sea level. So you're another 505 feet on the top of this, so you're well over the 1,000-foot mark up here. And while it's you know, a very nice day in my slide, you know, you can imagine what it's like in the winter up there. This is looking off to the right of the other view, and you'll see here that there's the remains of some sort of building there, which must date back to the tunnel works. But more to the point, in the background, if you look there, that's not a very straight line, but if you imagine that sort of following the ground, what you've got there is the remains of a reservoir, and I won't cover that in any greater detail at the moment, but just remember reservoir. There's also this is taken standing with my back to the shaft, and there's the remains of another building here within the foreground. As part of the ruins, there's obviously some sort of wet area. Again, more of this later on when I'll show you a more complete example. Back to the canal tunnel, a little bit further on from Puel, we come to the first of 4 safety adits, as they're called. There are numerous connecting adits between the tunnels. There are something like, well, I'll go for a figure of 36 between the canal tunnel and the original railway tunnel, which is at the top of the steps there. If you look carefully, you'll be able to see that there is actually a van parked in the tunnel there. That's the sort of white bit. I think the door's open. Yeah, the door is open. that was how they used to operate somebody to shadow the boats through. Down to the left, there's that thing that looks like a mouse hole. That was the means of getting stuff out of the second of the railway tunnels, because obviously they had to build that while the first railway tunnel was operating. So they had some sort of system for getting the spoil out through those small holes. We don't know the full details, but certainly in the sale particulars, when all the stuff was sold off, there were a lot of iron containers. At this point, normally when we're operating the chaperoning system, the chaperone would get off and report using this white box on the wall here, that all is well, and get permission to continue. That system has been in there since 2001, and frankly, it's getting well past its sell-by date. It breaks down with monotonous regularity. Immediately beyond that safety adit, Benjamin Outram must have realised that he'd made something of a mistake. Well, he probably realised already, because he'd had to line the whole of the previous section, which is mainly cut through shale. But at this point, there is a fault, and you go from shale into really hard rock. It's either a sandstone or a millstone grit, depending on what part you're at. You can see up in the top, you see that thing there, and that, and that. Those things are the remains of the hand-drilled holes where they put black powder in to blast the rock. Must have been a thankless task, because I mean, they wouldn't just drill those; they'd have to drill the whole of the working face to blast the rock. And according to some accounts, they were down to about a yard a week through this stuff. All of which added to the problems that they'd already got by building all those shafts, of course. This is a little bit further on. The thing going across is actually a bridge. I know you don't get bridges in most tunnels, but Standage Tunnel is unusual. When they built the latest railway tunnel, the double track one on the right hand side, they, similarly to previous ones, they dug adits through into the Canal Tunnel to take the spoil away. But once they completed the tunnel, they actually put in bridges to allow for maintenance people to cross over from one railway tunnel to the other. This is taken off the front of a narrow boat being chaperoned through. One of the problems on narrow boats is the lighting, and this one is a case in point. The light there is shining virtually down on the water surface, which is pretty much useless when you're standing on the back of a narrow boat with a long cabin in front of you. You virtually not be able to see that. Right, we're a little bit further on now. You'll remember that possibly that section that I showed you had two sort of summits to it. Well, we've gone under the first of those summits, which is called Puel Hill, and we're now looking into the Central Valley. I think this caused them a certain amount of problems in surveying, because I think you know, a lot of experience of surveying tunnels through hills, which went straight up and down, but I don't think they'd done a lot of surveying of things that had a central valley. But again, more of that later. Looking down here, you've got now the first shaft there is Flint New Shaft, which didn't appear on that listing I showed you earlier. This was one that they built as an extra when they were building the later railway tunnel. That's Flint or Puel Shaft, the next one down. There is an interesting brown splodge there, which I'll say more about shortly. In the distance, there is a place called Red Brook, which was the one that I mentioned had 2 shafts. And then the highest point of all is just beyond there, and then you start to drop down towards Diggle on the other side. The road that you see there didn't exist at the time of the building of the Canal Tunnel. The road at that time over Standage, the old coach road, more or less ran across here. So this place where we're looking from would have been a bit off the beaten track. This is back at Canal Tunnel level, although looking towards Marsden. This is the bottom of Flint New Shaft, which was the nearest of the ones on the previous view. Again, it's fairly wet, as you can see. They tried to do a job on it by putting various sort of metal sheeting to divert the water, but slowly but surely boaters have knocked them off, and it's now pretty much dropping right the way across. This is the opposite view to the one I showed you earlier. There's another of those boundary posts in the foreground, and you're looking up towards Flint New Shaft. The interesting feature is that little hut on the right-hand side, which was provided in World War II for the Home Guard, who were required to mount guard on all the shaft sites because of fear of German parachutists sabotaging the railway tunnel. I mean, it must have been a fairly grim job for the Home Guard, but not as grim as it was for the people who did the job first in 1939, which was the local territorial army, who were actually living under canvas at all the shaft sites, including that one I showed you earlier at Puel, which you know, is well over 1,000 feet above sea level. So you can imagine what that was like in the middle of a bad winter. This is the original Puel Hoyles or Flint Shaft, and you'll see that that's the shaft, and it has an engine house. And this is the answer to the thing I showed you earlier, where there were the fragmentary remains of some sort of building next to the shaft at Puel. What it is a water engine, or what it was is a water engine. You remember the reservoir I showed you, which is that thing there. It supplied water. The engine house sits about there over this shaft, and the water fills a large bucket, which by a system of gearing draws up a spoil bucket. And there you'll see that as well, that drainage adit with the shafts on it, which were so visible on that section. This is the view inside the engine house, and what you see there is the shaft which would have held the water bucket for, there is still water flowing into there to this day, although clearly the drainage adit is no longer functioning. Quite what depth of water you've got in there, I don't know, and I certainly don't propose to go in there and find out. This is looking from somewhere up the main road back towards that's the engine house there, and you'll notice there's a sort of level. I wish I could draw straight. There's a level there. You see the line in the vegetation. That is the line of the original water supply to that water engine. Still functioning to some extent to this day, although it's very much silted up now. I mentioned the brown splodge that you could see earlier on as well. This is the shaft that was started at Heathy Lee, filled with water. How deep that is at the present, I don't know, and again, I don't intend to try and find out. There are also remains of a building around here, although very, very fragmentary. This is off Google Earth. You'll see that's the main road there. So Puel, Hoyles or Flint is somewhere down this sort of area, just off the picture. That's the shaft we've just been looking at. That's the shaft that would have had the water bucket in it, and you can see the shafts going across here, which mark the line of the drainage adit. There are also some very interesting sort of things here, which I wonder if those are water courses. Although it's very, very difficult to identify anything on the ground. It's quite possible, but I certainly don't recommend anybody walking around on this area, because it's that sort of tussocky moorland grass where, you know, your foot keeps going down holes between the tussocks, and it's very, very difficult walking. I did go over as far as this sort of area, and I certainly don't recommend anybody going any further that way. If you get the full extent of this, there is an interesting sort of blob up there, which I wondered if it was the outlet of the tunnel, but if you walk across and you get to the point where that red splodge is, then it starts to go down very, very steeply indeed into a ravine. It must be over 50 feet deep, which tells you why they needed the shafts there. A little bit further on now, this is looking up towards Red Brook, which, as you'll see, also has an engine house. The stuff in the foreground here is spoil, probably dating from the Canal Tunnel and the early railway tunnels. In the background there is a bigger spoil heap, which dates from the final railway tunnel, by which time they were running out of places to put the spoil, so a lot more of it went up on the moors than in the earlier days. This is looking back the other way. This is the engine house you can see here. You can see the two flint shafts in the distance there. I think the brown splodger teeth is about somewhere in that vicinity, but perhaps just a shade offline there. I don't think they ever had a water engine at this one. I know at one stage they had two steam engines here, one to do the hauling and one to do the pumping. I think the pumping engine was at the far end, and against this end there was a beam engine which did the hauling. There are inside the building two shafts, but it's very, very difficult to work out what the working arrangements are. I have been in there once, but it's not a place I would recommend. Although these days they have actually gridded the shafts over, which is nice. This is down below Red Brook, where this is called Red Brook Wide. They dug a large cavern under here, which in their original ambition, I think, was going to be a major work site for building a lot of the tunnel. But it didn't come to pass. Again, you're talking about a place that's over 1,000 feet up, and they simply couldn't keep contractors up there. You know, it was the conditions in the winter must have been awful. And of course, eventually, with the financial troubles, they more or less gave up on it. All that was ever built here was the length which it showed on that original section, which was about 150 yards. So, you know, they dug two 500 feet deep shafts, and all they got out of it was 150 yards of tunnel. One of the shafts is above that timbering, which you can see there. The other one is down a sort of adit on the side there, which is lined in modern brick, but obviously wouldn't have been originally. One of the results of the well, I forgot what I was going to say now. I was going to eventually, when they got their act together, they called in Thomas Telford, the famous engineer. And Telford did a report on completion of the tunnel. He came in 1806, by which time I don't think they got that much further than it showed in that original section. He came up with a few ideas. He was responsible for the abandoning of the Heathy Shaft, which I don't think was even halfway down to the canal level by 1806. But he also set out a programme for completion, and although, as far as I can tell, he never came back again, the canal company stuck rigidly to his plan. And I think the last bits to be completed were the two bits either side of Red Brook, and this has resulted in two narrows. The two tightest places in the whole of the tunnel are either side of Red Brook, because I think they were in such a rush to meet Telford's deadline that they just hacked through as best they could and left it. This is up above on the top of the later spoil heap. That there is the now truncated Red Brook New Shaft, which was built. And there's some sort of building in the foreground of which I know nothing. This is the bottom of Red Brook New Shaft. a lot of the people who've sort of done illicit trips through the disused railway tunnel and keep putting videos on YouTube have trouble with the shafts. And one of the reasons is that not all of the shafts link to all of the tunnels. The original shafts, of course, all linked to the Nicholson Tunnel, the original tunnel. But these new shafts only link to the new tunnel. So anybody, you know, working off a list of the shafts is going to go wrong. Immediately beyond here is where that Narrows is. I haven't got a proper picture of the Narrows. You can see it's getting fairly tight in the distance there, but it's literally so tight that you can't get a picture of it off the back of a narrow boat, or off the front for that matter. I mean, you're sometimes down to a couple of inches either side of the boat. This is just coming out of the Narrows, and this is one of the joys of Standage Tunnel because it has an S-bend in the middle. They were something like 26 feet out of line when they finally met up. The last length of tunnel was dug from the Diggle direction towards Red Brook, and for some reason they got well out of line. I think the main problem was the lack of shafts to line the tunnel up on. It's a long way from here to Brun Clough, which is the first shaft going down the west side, and there's a problem there because Brun Clough shaft isn't actually on the tunnel line. So, you know, the standard practice of dropping plumb lines down and lining things up that way couldn't be done. So anyway, somehow or other they wandered off by 26 feet, and you end up with this S-bend. You'll notice that the S-bend is substantially reinforced in those brick arches that I mentioned earlier, and so is the section immediately after it for something like half a mile. This is a terrible section to steer through. The problem here, of course, is that being 26 feet out of line, when they finally built the double-track railway tunnel, in places there can't be much more than 10 feet of rock in between the two tunnels. So the damage that they did elsewhere paled into insignificance against this length. That's a little bit further on. There are some other wides. This is White Horse Wide. You'll notice on the wall there is a mooring ring. A lot of these wides were used when they built the later railway tunnels to keep the spoil boats in. I mentioned Brun Clough. This is Brun Clough. In the foreground there, you've got all that remains of Brook New Shaft, which is this sort of weed-filled thing in the foreground. It was their intention to build a new shaft at Brook, but they hit that much water going down that they had to abandon it. Further over, I think that is probably all that remains of a reservoir at Brook. That's the original Brook shaft, which they ended up enlarging, and then you'll see that there's a massive tip around there because obviously the stuff that they pulled out, they just had to tip it around that shaft. So any remains of engine houses and things like that are long gone. They'll be buried 20-30 feet underground. Down in the Canal Tunnel, though, the problem I mentioned earlier about Brook shaft being offline also caused a problem because when they came to link it to the new tunnel, as they wished to do, the only way to do it was by breaking a hole through the between the Canal Tunnel and the new tunnel. So this is the only place where, if you're going through the Canal Tunnel, you actually can see a train, and that sort of white bar of light that you can see at the bottom of the railings there is a train going past. This is looking back towards Marsden, so the previous view was off to the left there. The Brook Shaft itself is off to the right, down something of an adit. Let's move on. The other exciting thing about Brook is that when you're travelling through the Canal Tunnel, this is where you see the legendary light at the end of the tunnel. You can just see that tiny dot right in the distance. It's not a good idea if you're a boater going through to relax at this point, though, because that speck of light is at least half an hour away by boat. Further on, this is the only other open shaft on this side. This is a place called Coat Pit, although it has had various other names. It was originally the 6th pit, because I mentioned they took the opportunity of the lower ground on this site to dig a lot of pits. And then, of course, they abandoned 2 of the others, so it became the 4th pit in the minutes, and eventually it became called Coat Pit. I think it has at least one other name. Here you're down to a mere 237 feet deep. You can certainly notice the difference because when it's been raining for several weeks, as it is prone to do occasionally, it's a very wet place indeed down there. This is the aerial view of it. You can see that's the shaft there. That big spoil heap. Again, I think any buildings around there were probably probably buried in the railway era. But the interesting thing here is this thing here, which I think is a filled-in shaft on the drainage adit into the stream over there. Certainly, whatever it is, it's got reeds growing in it, so it's obviously something wet anyway. And I'm pretty sure it must be one of those shafts. Right. Yeah. The Diggle end of the tunnel actually is rather more natural rock than any other section, and so there's some really spectacular stuff in this end. This is where I came across the problem with Professor Schofield's account of the tunnel, because according to his account, well, he came up with some really bizarre stuff on the levels. He had the tunnel at the Marsden end sloping down 3 feet to the working face, which is bizarre, because I mean anybody at the working face would have realised well before they were working up to their armpits in water that there was a problem. But at this end, he said that the tunnel had to be lowered because it was built, I think, 2 or 3 feet too high. Well, I mean, there's no way this has been lowered, and because you're banging your head on natural rock, and they certainly haven't stuck the natural rock back afterwards. So when I eventually followed it up, whoever did the research had mixed up east and west, and that would have been comparatively simple, apart from the fact that it doesn't always say east and west. Sometimes it says Marsden and Diggle, in which case they hadn't mixed it up. So you've got a wonderful cocktail of errors, and that's what's led to this thing about the tunnel sloping and so on. I mean, the rest of his stuff is fantastic. You know, it's spot on, but I just worry that he didn't spot that one. This is what they spoil heap for one of those other 5 shafts that there were down the Diggle end. You can still see, I think, 3 of the spoil heaps for these. Various of them have vanished and been destroyed by later works. This is perhaps the most spectacular rock section. This appears on the front cover of the book, actually, but it really is something to see. Now we're getting close to the Diggle end, and we come to this very strange setup. I think this is a very old picture, and what it shows is an extension which was built at the Diggle end, and it was roofed over in well, I presume they'd be iron girders at the time in the 1890s. These days, a whole section of it has been replaced in concrete where the trains still go. That's the end of the extension. You can see on the left-hand side there, that's the palatial accommodation they provide for people doing the tunnel chaperone job. Not grand at all. And there's the date of the extension, 1893. Not exactly a triumph of the stonemason's art, that, but the date is accurate at least. What happened at Diggle? This is how it was built originally. The canal came up the locks to Diggle, and there were 2 large basins, and then it eventually entered the tunnel. When they built the railway line, what they did was to cut off the 2 basins, and they created a long straight section leading straight into the original tunnel entrance. I won't say much about the lengths at the moment, but I could be here all night if I get into that. This is the earliest picture we've got, and you can see there are the 2 abandoned ponds there. There's an abandoned canal bridge, and then you can see in the distance, I think, one of the 2 railway tunnels there. And this is what happened when they built the extension. They nominally extended it by 221 yards, but they also took off another, I think it's something like 37 yards of the original tunnel to take it back to where the new tunnel came out. This gives you the general idea. This has only recently come to light. This shows the work going on. So what you've got in the foreground there is where the extension was going to be. That's the new railway tunnel there. You can see the 2 old tunnels over to the right-hand side with smoke coming out of them. And the 37 yards, I think, they took off from there back to the new tunnel. It's quite a spectacular view. They also built a station at Diggle, and this is from virtually the same place as the last shot. So the station actually sat on top of the Canal Tunnel. So you've got the two earlier tunnels on the right, and there's a train coming out of the new tunnel there. So somewhere underneath here is that Canal Tunnel extension. And there we have what it looks like today. Somewhere under the greenery on the right is the remains of the island platform, and somewhere under the greenery on the left is one of the other platforms. You've also got this this thing here is a large cast iron tank. Anybody who had the Boys' Book of Railways back in the day will know that the main fact that Diggle appeared in there for was that it was the only place in the world, I think it was, where water troughs for the steam locomotives were actually sited within a tunnel. And the reason for that is that the section within the tunnel is the only bit of flat line all the way from Huddersfield through to, well, pretty much through to Manchester, I think. There was originally a reservoir somewhere off to the left of this picture, and that thing that you can see there was the header tank for the water troughs. I don't know if we've got much. Oh yes, there's this thing is quite interesting. This is something called the Standage Tunnel book. When they reopened the Canal Tunnel after doing all that work for 9 months, propping up various bits of it with brick arches, they started recording the boats going through. And this page shows the end of the last regular traffic, which is about there in 1913. That thing there is it refers to a firm called Buckley and Newton, who were flour millers in Staley Bridge, and they used to regularly send a boat over, or boats over, to Huddersfield to pick up grain. And this shows their boat Reliance in a lock below Slathwaite. They were the last. There were only 4 users generally after the Canal Tunnel reopened, and they were the last regular user. I mean, as you could see in the book, there were a few sort of odds and ends thereafter, but you know, just perhaps 1 boat a month or less. But the last regular traffic was Buckley and Newton. I think the only other thing I've got to mention is this man. This is David Whitehead. And David Whitehead claimed to hold the record for legging through Standedge Tunnel. And he claimed to have done it in 1 hour and 20 minutes. And when I tell you that the average time for taking a powered boat through these days is about 1 hour 30, 1 hour 40, you know, it just beggars belief. And there we are. That's a view of the book that was mentioned at the start, available from the Huddersfield Canal Society website, something like £10 including postage. And you'll notice that it has the obligatory foreword by Timothy West, who in recent years you haven't been able to publish a canal book without Timothy West. Right, I think that's oh.
Can you see the questions on the right there?
Yeah, sorry, my eyes aren't what they were. Let me have a look.
Put your camera back on.
Yeah, I'm trying to find it. That's me. Yeah. Right. Yeah. What have we got? Let's have a look. What do we got? Just trying to see what we got. Oh yes, we've got a question about how long is the tunnel. I was hoping nobody was going to ask that one. The big problem with the canal tunnel is that the length of it has changed so often that it's unbelievable. It was when they were digging it, they from the survey they predicted that it was going to be 5,477 yards long. When they eventually got it opened and measured it, they found out it was 5,445 yards long. Sometime early on, they changed the overflow from Tunnel End Reservoir and took it over the top of the canal tunnel. And that changed it to 5,456 yards. The extension, the 1893 extension, took it to 5,698 yards. And the latest figure, which was done by a firm called O'Varup when they were looking at restoring it, measured it as 5,675 yards. Now, I mean, there is an issue about how exactly you measure the length of a tunnel that's got a 26-foot error in the middle of it. You know, I mean, you cannot see through it from one end to the other. Whereas the railway tunnels, you can see through, and they're fairly consistent. The first two rail tunnels are 5,342 yards, and the third railway tunnel, the double track one, is 2 yards longer. So they're fairly consistent. But I mean, the canal tunnel has been messed about with that much down the years that, you know, it's positively frightening. While we're on the subject, before anybody asks too detailed questions about the shaft depths as well, the shaft depths are an even bigger minefield because the big problem you've got is that there are quite a lot of quoted depths for the shafts, but nobody ever says quite what they've measured from where to where they've measured. So at the bottom, you've got a problem whereby I think originally they measured to the bottom of the heading. Then at some time later, they started measuring to the top of the tunnel. At some time in the railway era, I think the depths were measured to track level in the railway tunnels. And I think at some stages, they've also been measured to the surface of the water in the canal tunnel. The latest ones, which again O'Varup did, although they didn't do all the shafts, I think they've taken now again to absolute bottom. You've also got a problem at the top end as well, because as you probably saw when we were looking at Brook New Shaft briefly, the shafts actually got deeper as they were digging them because they tended to pile all the spoil around the shaft. So Brook New Shaft actually ended up something like 40 feet deeper than it had been when they started. So so that's quite a complicated little story. What else have we got over here? A few nice compliments. I'll probably stick with those, I think. Yeah, I can't see. I can't see anything else that really needs an answer up there.
Are you on the Q&A tab?
Yeah, I think so. What?
Okay.
I can't see, unless you don't see anything I've missed.
Someone's asked, the wide section of the tunnel, is that shotcrete?
Yeah. There is an awful lot of shotcrete in there. When they restored it in 2001, anything they didn't particularly like the look of, they sort of meshed it over and then shotcreted it. It's not nice when you're taking boats through, you know, because it's the sort of stuff where if you catch yourself on it, it's a bit like coarse sandpaper, you know. It's and added to which it does rather spoil the look of the thing. But yeah, there is a lot of shotcrete in there.
What's the depth of the water in the Canal Tunnel?
Well, originally it was something like 8 or 9 feet deep, which is a lot deeper than the whole of that top stretch of the canal, including the tunnel and out as far as the top lock at either end, was dug something like 8 or 9 feet deep. The idea being that in dry periods they could run it down a little bit and still get boats through, although I think given the internal shape of the tunnel, that was probably wishful thinking. But exactly how deep it is to this day, I'm not entirely sure, because various bits of it have silted up quite badly. I mean, you can, you know, it's possible to ground a boat on the top pound at Marsden, so that's clearly not 8 or 9 feet deep by any means. But anyone who goes to either Marsden or Diggle, if you have a look at the top gate of the top lock at either end, compared to a normal narrow canal top gate, there is a whole extra panel on both of those gates.
Trevor, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
A few more questions, if you don't mind me reading them. A bit technical with this one. Shaft number 3, Puel. It's a square top that remains of a sighting tower.
Sorry?
I think it's more military, actually. It's a square the remains of a sighting tower at shaft number 3 at Puel. Okay, we'll pass on that one.
No, I don't think so. I mean, it is. There is actually, you know, the whole of the inside of that is actually taken up by a shaft, and the shaft is circular. So quite why they built. I mean, it's also built out of stone and brick, whereas all the others are built out of brick. But why they built it like that, I just don't know. There's no obvious reason for it.
Okay, early question.
And sorry, in its present state, it almost certainly dates from the 1890s, because when they built the final railway tunnel, they enlarged all the shafts.
Early question here. In the 210 years since the tunnel was completed, and now 20 years since it's been reopened to the public, has there been any maintenance to the tunnel since BWP, now of course, spent £5 million restoring it?
Maintenance. They do inspect it on a regular basis. I think it's something like every 3 years. I know going back to, I think it was 2019, sort of just before the season started, they had a team in there who were, you know, tapping away and sounding various things. I don't think they've had to do any serious maintenance to it, but then, you know, you wouldn't expect so when, you know, the amount of shotcreting and things like that they've done. But yeah, I mean, they do inspect it on a regular basis, and if it needs anything, it'll be done. Yeah.
In one of the pictures with the boat and the horse, with the man holding the horse, he looks like he's been using a type of crutch. I presume he's disabled.
Yeah, that comes from an old postcard. To be honest, I don't think the chap holding the horse is anything to do with the boat. I think he he's what's known as a local character. I think the whole idea of the postcard is to show him off. I've seen another postcard of Slathwaite with what may be the same chap on it, and I suspect as I say, I don't think they were taking a postcard of the boat. I think it was, probably part of a set of, local oddballs. I think certainly that was the account I heard when we first found that picture.
Right, that was from my friend Pat.
Yeah.
I'm just looking through the. What was the biggest challenge in restoring the Huddersfield Narrow Canal? Was it the tunnel?
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's a bit difficult to say, but yeah, I mean, the tunnel was certainly always the key thing. I think. I think we always took the view that if we got the tunnel, we'd get the whole canal. There were a couple of other bad bits towards either end. I mean, the canal had been substantially filled in through the middle of Staley Bridge, for example, and there was actually a factory on it at one stage. But you might say that nothing good ever comes out of a depression. But the factory closed down, which was a big advantage in Staley Bridge, and I think. In Huddersfield, a lot of work had to be done down there, including tunnelling under a couple of buildings that had been built on the line. So, but I think I would go with the tunnel, to be honest with you.
Okay, when were the 4 safety adits linking Canal Tunnel to Railway Tunnel built? The photo seemed to show new steps in an old tunnel.
Yeah, the 4 safety adits were part of the restoration, so there are other unrestored adits that are very similar, and there are some sort of natural rock things. I mean, you probably noticed that I wasn't entirely sure of the total number of adits, because I mean, there are some that have been blocked off, and there are others that are sort of unsafe, and and some that are positively tiny and you couldn't possibly walk through. But the safety adits, what they did was, when they were, as I mentioned earlier, they had health and safety worries when they reopened, and the safety adits were part of the answer to that. They would use these safety adits with the telephones. Boats would report in, and they would. Check the progress or keep them a certain distance apart, and that's what those were used for. And that's why those 4, which are roughly evenly spaced throughout the tunnel, that's why those were particularly restored as they have been.
Right, I think we've taken up most of your evening now. Hopefully you'll arrange, or the Canal Society will arrange another trip through for Subterranean Britannica when things are getting better. Trevor, thank you very much. And I hope everybody enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.